be with such an impressive panel of thinkers and doers in this sector. And what I'm hoping from them, and a challenge to you all, is can you share some predictions and thoughts with us that will help us feel a little bit less uncertain about the future and maybe even provide some hope? Who knows, maybe that will be a lovely outcome that we'll go away from this session feeling a little bit more certain and a little bit more hopeful. So, I'd like to get everyone just to introduce yourselves. So, who are you? What work are you doing in this area?
Hi everyone, my name is Eliza. I'm part of the University of Bristol. I'm a PhD student there. And I'm researching about alternative organizations, and particularly I'm looking into the case of MST in Brazil, the landless workers, which in Portuguese is Movimento dos Trabalhadores Rurais Sem Terra. And I'm looking specifically into their cooperatives.
Hi everyone, I'm Matt from Power to Change. So we're an organisation that supports community businesses. We were set up in 2015 as a spend-down trust, which basically meant we were given 150 million to grow the community business sector. And my role there is, so I'm a portfolio manager, so I manage our investments into sort of more innovative finance, things like community shares, enterprise grants, that kind of thing. And sort of throughout our lifetime, what we've tried to do is back things that can support community businesses to grow their trading income. So things like community shares, things like Kindred and Liverpool, to sort of encourage the growth of the sector in ways beyond sort of traditional grants.
Yes. Hello. I'm Tim Crabtree. So I work mainly for an organisation called Wessex Community Assets. We've been going for about 20 years, and we're involved in various things. We were set up as a kind of secondary organisation by a group of us who were involved on the ground in practical projects around things like food and housing and renewable energy. And we needed an organisation that could help us access land and finance. So most of our work has been around community land trust housing. We've just got some funding to work with Dorset Community Energy on a feasibility study for a retrofit service for Dorset. And on the finance side, I suppose the two main things we helped develop, one was community shares. So about 15 years ago, we got funding from Friends of Providence and ESME and Tudor to do the initial work around community shares, and then a number of pilot share offers. So that's an area that we've been very involved in. We also set up a home improvement lending organisation that's now called Lendology. It works with 20 local authorities in the southwest and lent out about 22 million to low-income homeowners. So it kind of feeds back into the work that we're now doing around retrofit. And I should also say, the last 6 years, I've been doing a part-time PhD at Plymouth University. It's kind of action research into community-led housing.
Great, thank you. So my first set of questions to each of the panellists is going to be about the kind of changes that they've seen in the sector and what changes they're looking forward to, or potential things on the horizon in the fields of kind of policy, finance and academia as sort of key and crucial areas for the movement. So, Tim, I'm going to go first to you, if that's okay. So you've been involved in the New Economics movement since 1984, you told me, and you were sort of foundational in working in creating the New Economics Foundation. So I'm really interested to know, what do you think has evolved over this time, can you tell me a bit more about how these ideas and concepts have changed and what has been embedded into kind of policy that we see today?
Okay, thanks. So actually, it's funny, isn't it? You kind of think 40 years, that's a long time. But actually, my first sort of introduction to kind of new economics was a BBC documentary program in 1979, which sometimes I meet people who watch this documentary. It's a bit sad, but it was about the Mondragon cooperatives. So in the Basque region of Spain, there's this group of about 80 cooperatives. They employ about 80,000 people. It's an amazing kind of ecosystem of cooperative enterprises. They have their own university, they have their own research and development departments, and it was set up in the 1950s by a priest who could see young people having to leave the area to go to Madrid and places to get jobs, and said, what we need is a college. Then he saw young people coming out of this college, and they were getting jobs in factories that were run by Franco supporters, and so they were always never getting promotion or whatever. So he then sort of said to them, well, actually, what you need to do is to set up a cooperative. So they set up one cooperative, and then another 3 cooperatives. When they had 4 cooperatives, the priest then said, what you need is a bank, because if local people don't save locally and put that money into new co-ops, we're not going to expand. And so the people involved in those 4 cooperatives just laughed and said, no, there's no way we can set up a bank and run a bank. So the priest said, that's fine, no worries. He went away and called a meeting 6 months later, and these managers said, oh, what's the meeting about? And he said, well, I've got this paperwork, and it seems that you're all directors of a new bank. So basically, he had forged all their signatures and set up a bank. So for me, that wasn't the inspiration. But I've always been really inspired by the Mondragon co-ops. I think because of the nature of the kind of ecosystem that they set up, and that's what's always been interesting to me. But when I was in my last year of university, I think, or second from last, there was a thing called the Other Economics Summit in 1984. There was a G7 summit in London, and a group of alternative economists came together to organize a kind of counter summit. And it was one of the first gatherings of kind of new economists from around the world. And so I went to that. I was really inspired. I'd been studying economics at university and hated it. And so this was a bit like Mondragon, sort of seeing an alternative, really. So I went to that. I went to the next one in 1985. And out of the Other Economics Summit, the New Economics Foundation was set up. And so I worked for New Economics Foundation for 5 years. And kind of going back to Alice's question, I think, like looking back over the last 40 years, on the one hand, I think there's been a lot of change and development in terms of the thinking around new economics, but also there are certain kind of key sort of ideas and principles that have stayed the same. So, for example, I think one of the things that we were looking at 40 years ago was the whole issue around rent and rent extraction. And without going into the kind of boring technicalities, if you go back to the classical economists like Ricardo and Marx, what they were concerned about was, for example, landowners who held onto their land and basically extracted rent from the people who were working that land. And so one of the big issues that was kind of shared across these classical economists was, how do we deal with this rent extraction? How do we stop this kind of monopolization almost of a resource? And so that theme kind of goes through new economics right to the day, and it's dealt with in different ways, but you're looking at things like land or labor or finance and asking, how do you take away that rent extraction through democratic structures? And so, as I say, 40 years ago, when I look back, we had much less examples of organizations that were trying to democratize the workplace or democratize finance or democratize land. And so I think there has been a real shift on the ground. I mean, 40 years ago, you really had to look around and search for examples of community enterprises or finance initiatives. But nowadays, it does feel that there's been a sea change in terms of that practical area. And I think what's interesting then is that you also have this proliferation of different theories. And I think one of the challenges we've got is to avoid a kind of fragmentation. You've got things like donor economics or community wealth building, etc., etc. But actually, I think within those, there's a lot of commonality, and we need to find ways to see that commonality and not as a sort of movement fragment. I think it's really important that we find ways to sort of work together. So that would be my takeaway, that there's a real positive shift in the number of practical initiatives that you see on the ground in these different areas. And I think also there's been a really, really interesting sort of rise in different theories that complement each other. And so the last thing I'd say is that the ones that I draw on most, one is community economies. So these geographers called J.K. Gibson Graham developed these ideas around the diverse economy and the community economy, and I'd really recommend the Community Economies Institute's work and the Community Economies Research Network. And the other is, I draw a lot on an anthropologist called Tim Ingold. And I did actually bring some books because I knew this was a sort of analog thing. And there's a lovely book called Making. And one of the things that Tim Ingold has been really good at has been sort of bridging between different disciplines like anthropology and archaeology, architecture, design. But what he also says is that we can't just live in our heads, that we have to link together ideas with materials and making. And I think it's so relevant for things like community housing, community energy, retrofit, that we've got to have the ideas, but we've also got to get our hands dirty as well. So I would recommend this book. I think it's great.
Great. I think that is a good segue to Eliza's sort of field of academia. So I'm really interested to know, what developments or shifts do you see happening in kind of language and theory in the field of new economics? And what do you feel academia can contribute to the future of the movement?
So I think it would be important to say that I'm part of the business school. And when you think that, it's a very prestigious university and the business school, all of that, you expect it to be, very classical in some of the teachings. But actually, you see these ideas of new economics really gaining traction. And it's instead, like in the past, it was seen as something as the other, as the, the alternative, but in a way that it's not positive. And right now, like when you bring these ideas of Gibson Graham, for example, and you talk about, cooperatives and alternative organizations, it has space. People want to discuss about this. And I think the pandemic has played quite a role in this shift in perception in academia, because it's not possible to deny anymore that we're going through many crises. And I suppose climate change did the same. So it gave some traction for these kinds of theories and possibilities of thought to grow in these spaces that before were very traditional in their way of seeing and thinking. And I suppose drawing on what Tim said before, so there is a lot of new theories coming up that are opening up spaces for discussions in academia that before we didn't have. So when we talk about diverse economies, for example, or community economies, and you challenge the idea of capitalism, capitalocentrism, and you offer the possibility to say, yeah, this exists, and, all the inequalities caused by it, but it's not the only option. There are other options, and here are some examples. And then you open space in theory as well for what is becoming, of what is emerging, the new things that don't necessarily have a shape yet, things that don't necessarily are super theoretically articulated, but they exist, and they show that there is a possibility. So I think there is a space in academia, at least from my experience, that you can explore these new possibilities now, and you theorize while the things are still shaping up and becoming something new. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. So Matt, last but not least, so I guess thinking about sort of practical applications, so Power to Change obviously has been a kind of great contributor of sort of knowledge and resources around the kind of financing of the movement. And I know that there's a kind of a sort of shift that Power to Change are undertaking, sort of trying to break the cycle of kind of grant dependency. And so I'm really interested to know what is the kind of role for Power to Change in the movement, but more importantly, I guess, what new mechanisms, funding, financing solutions do you see being used by the sector in the future?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not an academic in terms of my background. 11 years ago, I wrote a dissertation when I was at university about the decline of pubs in rural areas, which, on reflection, was quite a Nigel Farage-style dissertation in its title. But I think that was where my interest in sort of community ownership came about, where I interviewed the first, community-owned pub in England. So, in terms of like Power to Change's direction, I think it's worth reflecting that it was quite a big shift in the sector for us to sort of move away from being a spend-down trust where we were delivering sort of significant support in terms of a lot of funding to the sector. And I think in terms of how we're hoping to operate moving forward, so I think there's three things really for us. I think one is trying to work a lot more closely with others. So in the past, we've done a lot of funding programs, or we've supported things like, the growth of the community shares market, or it might be, other interventions we've made. But I think we've potentially historically ended up sort of just doing that by ourselves. I think that's often a mindset of spend down trusts where you're just moving on to the next thing. So I think what we're hoping to do a lot more in sort of our new way of operating is working alongside other funders working alongside others to get that support out. I think related to that, we've got a lot of evidence now. So I think we were quite unique when we were set up, that we set aside, I can't remember the exact percentage, but more than you would generally expect was set aside for research and evaluation purposes. And what that's meant is we've got loads of amazing evidence that shows that you don't have to just rely on traditional grants, or if you want to support more communities to take ownership of assets that matter to them, there's mechanisms you can provide to empower them that potentially not always has been applied potentially by other trusts and foundations. So we're trying to use that evidence to encourage more organisations to deliver that kind of support. And then I think lastly, I think it's about we are going to be using our position of sort of having quite good relationships with the new now Labour government, whether that's with government departments. We've got seconded members of staff within combined authorities, and also we've sort of been spending the last couple of years, working with the previous, government, but also, using those really positive relationships we have with the Labour government to sort of, make the case for interventions to support the sector. And I think, practically speaking, that is things like funding and support, but I think it's also things like revisiting interventions that can support the growth of the sector, things like SITR, things like other tax incentives, and then, of course, the community ownership fund as well. In the very immediate term, we know that a lot of organisations were left in the lurch. There was that last round open that was kind of, the rug was pulled from underneath people, and I think it's a challenging situation because the point of the community ownership fund was to support at-risk assets. So those assets are still going to be at risk while they're waiting to see what happens next. So I think a very immediate term for us to be doing is really advocating for at the very minimum making decisions on those final applications, but also a bigger call for a larger community ownership fund of £1 billion rather than what it is at the moment. So.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to go on to a sort of second question, more forward-looking. So I'm going to ask the panellists to draw on their experience to make some predictions about what we might see happen under the new Labour government and more generally in the UK. Tim, I'm going to ask you first. So I guess in the last sort of under the Tory government, we've seen various kind of political and ideological agendas, like the big society levelling up. And I guess those of us that are working in the kind of new economies movement, we've, maybe had an uneasy relationship with those kinds of agendas, having to kind of get into bed with those agendas to try and sort of further our aims. So what might we have to do in the next government? What kinds of agendas, stories, are likely to come out, and how might we kind of influence within these agendas?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Quite a challenge. Okay, so I'll start with housing. So, I mean, if we had the ear of government, I think we would say, the Labour Party is saying that they want to be able to build whatever it is, 300,000 houses a year, but at the moment they're reliant on the 8 big housing developers to do that. Those big housing developers won't get out of bed for something that doesn't deliver them 25% profit. I mean, it's quite amazing. Tesco's works to 5% profit. But if you look abroad, you look at Europe, somewhere between 50 to 80% of the housing that is built in countries in Europe are built not by speculative house builders, but by SMEs or co-ops or other forms of group housing. And that's where we've got to get to into this country. I mean, it's a real challenge, but we are not going to solve the housing crisis if we rely on these big 8 developers. So how do we get beyond that? I think the Labour Party has really got to get to grips with this whole thing of land value capture. So as you know, if you buy an acre of land for 10 houses, the acre of land agricultural value is worth £10,000, but once it's got planning permission, it's worth £1 to £2 million. So the question is, who captures that value? And what they're doing in other countries is they're saying, well, there's clearly a role for local authorities to be the ones who buy that land at agricultural value, that then they put in the infrastructure, get the planning permission, put in the design codes, and then they put out an invitation to a whole range of different housing solutions. So it might be SMEs, it might be collaborative housing groups, it might be housing co-ops, but we don't then have the sort of 5 years of sort of getting to the point where you can actually deliver a housing project because the local authority has done that for you. So that, to me, is really going to challenge that grip that those 8 companies have on house building in this country. So that would be my primary aim around housing, and I think that then that leads you into the whole area around energy. So, for example, in Bridport, where StirToAction is based, we're about to have 760 houses built by Barratt's, but because they got the planning permission for that in 2017, they're going to build those houses with gas boilers, no solar panels, etc., etc. And so in about 10 years' time, all of those new houses are going to need to be retrofitted. So if you add up all the amount of money that's going to be spent on that retrofitting of new houses, it's just absurd. So again, the government has got to really grasp the nettle and say we have to have proper standards for all the new houses that are built. As I say, pragmatically, the next few years, those 8 companies are going to be, still operating, but we've got to have that long-term shift over the next 5 to 10 years away from that model. And there's some, again, in Bridport, we've got a really interesting example. There's a 53-house co-housing project. The land is owned by a community land trust, but there's a microgrid on those houses, and it's been financed by Bristol Co-operative. Basically, all that energy feeds into batteries, and then there's a cooperative that then sells the energy back to the residents. So there's so much opportunity around that, linking decent housing with decent sort of energy efficiency and energy generation. So I think that's where I would really like to see the government sort of grasping the nettle and, bringing change.
Great, thank you. And I guess actually a big part of unlocking those industries, housing and energy, is around finance. And I know that there are so many amazing examples of where sort of community shares have played a role in enabling those community-led developments. Which brings me over to Matt for your question. And I guess you've already kind of hinted a little bit about the Community Ownership Fund and how that provided a good resource for these kinds of initiatives, but was very disastrous and clumsy in its implementation, and hasn't really matched the potential of the sector. So, what do you think we can expect from future government funding programmes, or do we need to be working to kind of unlock these sort of community-led solutions, community shares? What can we be doing to get those sort of enabled and unlocked?
Yeah, so I think sort of starting on COF, I think Labour still haven't said either way whether they're committed to that, but I think what we'd be pushing for is any sort of future support that's implemented, that it works together. So, things like the community right to buy, or community wealth funds, they could work in tandem together to unlock more assets for communities. And I think that's something that hasn't, particularly with COF, it was centralised. And I know that in Mark Gregory's Community Ownership Commission, he was calling for that to be, distributed by local authorities. We know that Labour, have a focus on devolution, so potentially it could move to a more regional level. But I think ultimately, whatever they do, what I would really hope to see is that it's working in partnership and in tandem with communities and recognising who is the expert. So I think, again, an issue with COF was it wasn't the people who really understood their communities and understood their needs, and, whether that's on a local level or with infrastructure bodies as well. I think that's where, it really stumbled, that it wasn't appropriately reaching out to people. I think the other thing we'll probably see from Labour is they're really keen to see matched investment when they're putting money out to the sector, so philanthropic capital, social investment, whatever that might be. And I think, again, it's about, championing in the sector where, there's been really successful stories around leverage as well. So in the, through the Community Shares Booster Fund last year, for every £9.30 the community put in, it was matched by £1 of institutional investment. So it's a really nice story to say, not just to other trusts and foundations, but also to government that, you're not only supporting communities to bring things into ownership and have that control and say over how things are run, but it's making your money go a lot further. I think in terms of practically how they're going to bring all of this together, so a Labour MP, Stephen Timms, recently called for an office for the impact economy, which I think is a really nice idea. It could give strategy and resource to delivering that support to our sector. But again, with a lot of these things, it's early days, and it's going to be up to organisations like us and people in the room to sort of be really pushing Labour on some of these things, particularly when they're in this period of a lot of energy and needing sort of exciting things to grab onto as well.
Great, thank you. And I guess looking at kind of more, grassroots infrastructure, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your research. You've focused on the kind of role of cooperatives and solidarity movements in creating sustainable food systems in Brazil. And I wondered if you could kind of share your thoughts on, what is the sort of bottom-up approach that we could be learning from in the UK to sort of, make our food systems more sustainable and fit for the future. And I guess also what sort of structural support might we need to kind of unlock this grassroots change?
So MST is a social movement that fights for land reform. Brazil has a long history of colonization, and one of the legacies of this colonization is the concentration of land in the hands of very few families. You can literally count these families. And also, I think something was happening in the world in '84 because they were born in the same, like MST started in the same time. Yeah, so they are 40 years old as well. And it's really interesting to see that structurally very few things have changed, but they are able now to really push the government, the Brazilian government, in terms of distributing land. So they occupy this unproductive land that is not serving a purpose, either social purpose or environmental purpose, and they push the government to lease this land for the use of MST members. So they, like throughout these 40 years, they developed very good strategies of collaboration nationally, but also locally. So all the initiatives of MST, they are very localized. They are placed in this community and in a specific time. So they really attend to the local needs. It's not detached from context. And I think that's something very, very important to learn from them. And I mean, we heard so many experiences and examples today that say exactly the same thing. So there is something there that we could learn from them. And also another thing that I think is really, really interesting is the collaboration amongst the other movements. So there is quite a lot of exchange and support, mutual support between these different movements. And I can only talk about Brazil, is where I come from and the context that I know. So it's never this alone battle. You are always together with other movements, other people, because there's always something else to fight for. And together, when you unite forces, like fighting for things that collectively make sense, then you are stronger. Like you have a solid case to, push the government to do some kind of change and to create actual change that people want and people need. So I suppose these are a few things that, I could say that MST has to teach us in the wider sense of how to move the new economy to the mainstream. Yeah.
Thank you. So I know we're almost out of time, so I'm going to do a quick fire round to sort of summarize. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to maybe say in a few words, very brief, because otherwise we'll run out of time, 2 questions. 1, can you look into your crystal ball and give us one prediction that might surprise the audience or tell us something new? And then the second one is one hope, so your hope for the future, so something you would like to see happen. So very quick fire round. We'll go this way round. Tim first.
Well, I am confident that things can't be as bad as they have been the last 14 years. I mean, whether they're going to get really better over the next 5 years, I don't know. But God, it's got so much better than 2 weeks ago. And any predictions? I don't know. I'm very optimistic around the community energy sector and the retrofit sector. I think there's a lot of money going to go into that sector, which can support social enterprises, cooperatives, community energy groups. So I feel optimistic that sector is really going to sort of burgeon over the next 5 years. I'm optimistic about that.
Great, thank you. A little slither of hope there. Matt?
I think something I would really like to see is, more long-term institutional investment, so things like money that's locked up in pensions, that kind of thing. We're, as a country and globally, we're in a really, precarious position with our climate. And I think when you look at things like pension funds where significant amounts, huge amounts of money. I think, the Make My Money Matter campaign said that £88 billion of UK pension funds is invested in fossil fuels. So I think something I'm really hopeful for is, I just think a change will have to happen. I think there's a growing public interest in where, these like long-term investments are kept. And I think, we will hopefully see like a positive shift there. And I think practically speaking, it's something Power to Change. We're commissioning a bit of work to try and look into how, we can sort of move more of that money into sort of more positive investments. And I know there's things like the local government pension funds, which are making positive steps. So it's kind of, I'm optimistic for the long term because I think it just has to change. So there's not really an option.
I would say, like being with MST for the past months, it gave me a lot of hope that, a movement that is so criminalized in Brazil, in a country that can be very conservative, even though like from the outside it seems very progressive, and seeing the amount of change that they are able to do, even with everything against them, everything. If you think that, local communities face hardship, try to talk like with people that have no land, no education, no nothing, and they do really unbelievable and transformative change. So for me, working with them was like, if they can do that, and the amount of change and transformation that they were able to do, like, we can do it all. So I suppose we have agency, we have the possibility to create change.
Oh, lovely. Thank you so much. So we're ready to take questions if people want to. What I might also do is suggest that as this is the final session and you've all been kind of listening to panellists for the whole day, what we might do is maybe take one question, and then what I might get you to do is throw it over to you and talk to the person next to you about those two questions that I asked the panellists. What's your prediction? What's your hope? So get you talking to each other. So maybe if there's anyone got any questions they'd like to ask the panel.
Thanks for that. I didn't actually catch the beginning, but what I did catch was great and really informative. So thanks a lot. The one question I have is about. It's actually more aimed at Tim than anyone else, but if anybody else has some thoughts, then that would be great. Last time I heard you talk, Tim, you were doing a lot of work around hemp, and I think I heard down the grapevine that you're doing less with hemp these days, and I remember you saying that one of the main stumbling blocks was actually processing it, because there's nowhere in the southwest really. Do you have to go up to Birmingham to process it? I can't remember what you said. But I think you also said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it would be, you'd have to get sort of about 250k in order to build a plant that, that would be kind of financially viable, for a size that would be worth it. Is that right? And the follow-up question would be, that doesn't seem like a huge amount of money in the great scheme of things for helping a new industry to burgeon. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so the reason we've got into hemp is because hemp, it's an amazing crop that sequesters carbon something like 13 times faster than trees. And if you can then lock that carbon up into, in our case, construction, into buildings, then that's a really positive thing. So for the last 3 years, we've been working with local farmers. We got funding from DEFRA, Farming in Protected Landscapes, to work with some local farmers to do field trials of hemp. It's very challenging. You have to get a license from the Home Office Drugs and Firearms Agency. You get that for 3 years, costs you money. So we had to de-risk that for the farmers. You then have to process it, and I could be really boring about the long processing of hemp. We have bought one of the machines that allows that. Sort of costs us about 16,000, but it's still at a very small scale. So we are looking at whether you can then get to that next level, because beyond that, a plant to process hemp might cost you £2 million, but it would be a regional plant. And what we're interested in is how do you have a plant, in our case, for Dorset, similarly one in Devon, etc., rather than shipping all this material around the place. This year we're also growing flax, because there's a lot of people interested in textiles in our area, and we're working with a couple of universities to develop some open source processing machinery for flax, because I've always worked in 3 sectors: food, housing, energy, because those are kind of like the basic sectors. But actually textiles, I've kind of come to realize houses are full of textiles, fabrics, clothes, all that. And anyway, so we're also growing flax with local farmers. And I think that whole open source movement is really interesting. So we're taking an existing iteration of small-scale flax processing machinery, which we're building that in Bridport, and then that's going to be like a mini mill for making textiles. So, yeah, we haven't stopped. But anyway, that's just a sort of offshoot of what we've been doing, yeah.
And I think, Tim, you're doing a panel tomorrow, aren't you, about housing? So maybe there's an opportunity to talk then about sort of more about sustainable building materials and, you know, how that fits into this.
Yeah, we've got 4, I'm only facilitating it, but there are 4 amazing speakers coming tomorrow, and the whole theme is about how we do housing differently at a community-led level. And so the materials and the construction processes that we use. So yeah, that's 2:00 tomorrow.
So there's a chance for you all to geek out on hemp. With that, if we've got a few minutes, no. Yes. Yeah, no, of course. So everyone's, you're getting hungry probably for your dinner. So with that, could you give a round of applause for the panel, please?